I remember the first time I realized that my family and I were on completely different paths. It wasn't a single moment of confrontation or a dramatic argument that set the stage. It was a series of small, piercing incidents that slowly chipped away at the foundation of my world. I had always believed that family was unshakable, that loyalty and blood ties could survive almost anything. But that illusion shattered faster than I could have imagined. It began subtly with glances and comments that carried judgment instead of love. I had chosen to marry young, swept away by a man who promised adventure and a life that felt full of possibility. My family had reservations, of course, whispers about his past and doubts about whether he was good enough for me. I waved them off, insisting that my heart knew the truth better than anyone else could. I wanted to believe it was that simple, that love could bridge every gap. At first, everything seemed perfect. The early days of marriage were intoxicating, a whirlwind of laughter, shared dreams, and quiet nights that felt sacred. But beneath the surface, the fractures had already begun. My husband and I were different in ways that I had ignored, blinded by the excitement of new beginnings. He was impulsive, reckless with money and emotions alike, while I craved stability and respect. Small disagreements erupted into late-night fights. I tried to ignore them, thinking they were temporary, thinking love could smooth over any rough edges. But those edges only grew sharper with time. It wasn't just the fights with my husband that drained me. It was the silent coldness from my family. Each phone call became a test, each visit a reminder that I was no longer aligned with the people who had once been my anchor. They criticized my choices, questioned my judgment, and reminded me constantly that I was failing in ways they could already foresee. I remember one afternoon sitting in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of my teenage life, and realizing that the home I had known as a sanctuary no longer felt like mine. Their words echoed in my mind. "We told you so. We warned you. Why can't you see it?" Then came the day when my world truly began to unravel. It was a Thursday, a day I will never forget, not because it was particularly dramatic or violent, but because it was the moment I realized that I had lost everything I thought I held dear. I returned home from work to find my apartment empty. My husband had left, taking with him every possession that had once signified our life together. Furniture, photographs, even the small personal items that seemed insignificant until they were gone. The note he left was brief and cold, a single line that cut deeper than any argument ever had. "I can't do this anymore." I sat on the bare floor for hours, the silence pressing down on me, suffocating and complete. The walls seemed to close in, and I felt a hollow ache where my heart should have been. In that moment I understood that the life I had built, the future I had imagined, had been an illusion. My family's disapproval now felt prophetic, a cruel confirmation that I had walked blindly into a storm I could not control. It was then that I realized the first truth of my new life. I was utterly alone. Not just physically, though the empty apartment emphasized that, but emotionally. The people who should have been my safety net were the ones who had distanced themselves, leaving me to face the consequences of choices they had warned me against. I thought about calling my mother, my father, even my siblings, but the words died in my throat. How could I explain that I had failed, that I was broken, and still hope for compassion? Their love had always come with conditions, and now I feared I had violated every one of them. The days that followed were a blur of practical survival. I had to find a place to stay, gather what little I could salvage from the remnants of my former life, and confront the financial reality of being completely independent. Every step was a reminder of how far I had fallen, how fragile the structures of my life really were. Friends offered temporary support, but I could sense their unease. They didn't fully understand the depth of my isolation, or the magnitude of the rejection I had endured. They could lend me a sofa or a meal, but they could not fill the emptiness left by family and love lost. One afternoon, as I wandered the streets without purpose, I noticed the city seemed alive in a way that both comforted and frightened me. Couples walked hand in hand, parents laughed with children, and strangers passed by without a second glance. I felt like a ghost moving through a world that had already decided I didn't belong. Yet, in that anonymity I discovered a strange freedom. I could disappear, reshape myself, and redefine the life I wanted, though I didn't yet know what that meant. It was during these long, lonely walks that I first realized I was pregnant. The news came like a whisper in a storm, startling and impossible to ignore. I was terrified. I didn't have a partner, my family had distanced themselves, and the apartment I had managed to rent was barely enough for me alone. How could I bring a child into this world? And yet, amid the fear, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. This tiny life depended on me, and suddenly survival was no longer just about myself. Pregnancy brought its own set of challenges. My body changed in ways that were uncomfortable, my mood swung unpredictably, and my sleep became restless and shallow. Nights were the hardest, when silence filled the rooms and memories of betrayal and abandonment became unbearable. I would cradle my belly and whisper promises to this unborn child, pledging that I would do everything I could to protect them, to build a life full of love and stability, even if I had never fully experienced it myself. I sought medical care, sometimes walking miles to attend appointments, learning how to navigate a system that often seemed indifferent to my struggles. I researched every detail about pregnancy, nutrition, and childbirth, determined that knowledge would be my armor. The more I learned, the more I felt in control, but the fear never fully left me. Every kick, every flutter of life inside me reminded me of both the fragility and resilience of existence. Financial concerns became a constant shadow. I picked up freelance work, delivered packages, and stretched every dollar as far as it could go. Each paycheck was a victory, a small claim of independence in a world that had shown me how easily I could be left behind. Some nights I cried, exhausted by the relentless pressure of survival. Yet I never let despair take root. I had to be strong, not just for myself but for the life growing within me. Isolation remained a persistent companion. I missed the warmth of family, the comfort of old friendships, and even the presence of my husband, though I knew our relationship was irrevocably broken. I wrote in journals, spoke to myself aloud in empty rooms, and tried to find solace in small rituals, lighting candles, preparing meals, even watching the sunrise from the fire escape of my apartment. These small acts became lifelines, threads of stability in an otherwise chaotic world. The winter months were particularly brutal. Cold air seeped through the windows, and heating bills consumed what little money I had. Yet, I forced myself to keep moving, to adapt and to learn. I discovered hidden strengths, patience I hadn't known, resourcefulness I had underestimated, and an inner voice that refused to let me give up. Every hardship became a lesson, every obstacle a test of resilience. By spring, I had created a modest but functioning life for myself and my unborn child. The apartment was small but clean, the work was steady, and I had cultivated a few friendships that were genuine and supportive. I felt a flicker of pride for the first time in months. I had survived betrayal, abandonment, and rejection. I had taken the fragments of my old life and begun to forge something new. And yet, despite progress, fear lingered. I worried endlessly about the future, about being enough, about providing love and stability for a child in a world that had often felt indifferent. But amidst the anxiety, there was a growing certainty. I was capable. I had endured more than I ever thought possible, and I would endure what was to come. Through the fear, through the loneliness, and through the relentless struggle, I began to see a path forward. It would not be easy, and it would not be without pain, but I had discovered something profound: the capacity to survive, to nurture, and to hope even when the world seemed determined to break me. The first months of living alone while carrying a child were unlike anything I had imagined. The loneliness was profound, a quiet presence that settled into every corner of my tiny apartment. Some nights I would sit on the floor with my back against the wall, tracing the contours of my growing belly, and feel a mixture of fear, awe, and exhaustion. I was about to bring life into a world that had already shown me how cruel it could be. And I had no one to rely on but myself. Fear became a constant companion. I worried about money, about health, about whether I could be a good mother. Every decision carried weight, from what groceries to buy to how I would rearrange my day to accommodate my changing body. Sometimes I would wake up in a panic, imagining scenarios of illness, of not being able to provide, of losing the child before even meeting them. It was overwhelming, but it also forced me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. During the day, I focused on survival. I took freelance jobs wherever I could, delivered packages, worked odd shifts, anything that would keep food on the table and the lights on. I became painfully aware of how fragile independence was when you had no safety net. There were mornings when I questioned whether I could keep going, whether I had the strength to continue on this solitary path. But then I would feel the flutter of life inside me, and I knew that giving up was not an option. Even as I managed the practical side of life, the emotional toll was relentless. I had no one to confide in completely. Friends offered sympathy, but few could understand the depth of the isolation, the constant vigilance required to keep both myself and my unborn child safe. I learned to compartmentalize my fears, to push them aside during the day while finding small, private moments at night to process the grief and anxiety. Writing became my therapy. Each journal entry was a conversation with myself, a way to sort the chaos in my mind and confront the fear that had no one else to witness it. I remember one afternoon, sitting in a quiet corner of a small coffee shop, watching mothers with their children. There was something both beautiful and terrifying about the way they interacted. The love, the patience, the exhaustion. I saw myself reflected in them, not because my life was the same, but because the raw, unfiltered experience of caring and protecting a child resonated with a deep, primal understanding. I would soon join that circle of mothers, but in my own way, forged through struggle and independence rather than ease and comfort. The months dragged on, each one a mixture of growth and anxiety. My body changed dramatically, and with each new curve and stretch mark, I felt a complex mix of pride and vulnerability. I was amazed at the resilience of life, the way the body could adapt and nurture another being despite the chaos around it. Yet there were nights when I cried until my eyes were swollen, haunted by the absence of family and the betrayal of my husband. The void left by their rejection was profound, a shadow that lingered even in moments of small triumphs. I learned quickly that I could not afford to dwell too long on what I had lost. The child growing inside me demanded presence and focus. I had to find a balance between mourning my past and preparing for the future. I developed routines, early mornings filled with quiet stretches and mindful breathing, days occupied with work and errands, evenings with reading or journaling to soothe my mind. The structure became a lifeline, something I could control in a life that often felt unpredictable. Financial struggles were constant, and the reality of supporting a child alone without family help weighed heavily on me. I budgeted obsessively, found second-hand stores for necessities, and learned to prioritize what was essential. Every purchase was deliberate, every choice calculated, and the anxiety of potential setbacks never fully disappeared. But with each successfully navigated challenge, I felt a growing sense of capability and resilience. I was learning not just to survive but to manage, to plan, to anticipate difficulties before they arose. Socially, I became more selective and cautious. I had few interactions outside of work and errands, and I often declined invitations that might leave me feeling exposed or vulnerable. Trust was difficult, and I guarded it fiercely. Friends who understood boundaries became precious, and I cultivated these relationships carefully. They were not substitutes for family, but they provided small islands of support in an otherwise isolating existence. The emotional work of preparing to become a mother alone was immense. I practiced patience, developed coping strategies for stress, and built rituals to connect with my unborn child. I would talk to them, read stories aloud, and play music to soothe both myself and the life growing within me. These small acts became sacred moments, a way to assert my agency and nurture despite fear and uncertainty. One particularly harsh winter night, I remember sitting by the window, watching snow drift lazily to the ground. I was exhausted from a day of work and errands, my body sore, my spirit frayed. Yet I felt a strange sense of connection to the world outside. Life continued despite hardship, and somehow I was still here. Still breathing. Still protecting the tiny life that depended on me. That night, I whispered promises into the quiet. I would do everything in my power to ensure their safety, their joy, their love, even if it had to come from me alone. With time, I noticed subtle changes within myself. I became more resilient, more attuned to my own needs and instincts. I learned to identify when my body or mind required rest, when fear was clouding judgment, and when determination needed to take the lead. The pregnancy, though fraught with fear, had become a teacher, guiding me toward self-reliance and strength I had never fully realized. There were moments of tenderness and unexpected joy. I found beauty in the mundane. A soft afternoon light, a stranger's kind gesture, the quiet hum of the city below my apartment. These small moments became anchors, reminders that life, though difficult, was also full of wonder and possibility. I clung to them fiercely, using them as shields against the darker currents of fear and anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me. Even as I grew stronger, the shadow of my husband's departure lingered. Memories of betrayal and broken promises haunted me, and I often questioned my own choices. Yet I refused to allow regret to dominate my existence. Instead, I used it as fuel to move forward, to make better decisions for the life I was building for my child and myself. I realized that the past could not be changed, but the future was mine to shape. By the third trimester, I had established a rhythm. I knew how to manage my energy, budget my resources, and protect my emotional well-being. I had grown more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. And though the fear of giving birth alone and raising a child without family support never fully disappeared, I discovered that courage often resides in persistence, in the quiet decision to keep moving forward, even when the world feels unforgiving. Through every trial, I learned that independence was not just about surviving physically, it was about nurturing emotional strength, cultivating resilience, and embracing responsibility with grace. I became attuned to the rhythms of life and the quiet heartbeat of the child inside me, finding purpose in the smallest victories, the tiniest moments of joy. And in this period of solitude and preparation, I realized the profound truth. The absence of others does not negate the capacity for love, hope, and courage. I was alone, yes, but I was also capable, resilient, and determined. This life growing inside me was a promise, a reason to endure, and a beacon guiding me through the darkness of isolation and fear. The days following the arrival of my child were both overwhelming and transformative. The first cries, so small and fragile, carried the weight of a universe I had never known. Holding this tiny, perfect being in my arms, I felt both terror and an inexplicable, all-consuming love. Every decision, every movement, every breath now carried consequence beyond myself. I was no longer just surviving. I was responsible for another life, and the stakes could not have been higher. Sleep became a distant memory. Nights were long and filled with the ceaseless rhythm of feeding, changing, soothing. There were moments when I would rock my child for hours, staring into their wide, trusting eyes, marveling at the miracle of existence, even as exhaustion pressed heavily on my body and mind. At times, I felt on the brink of collapse, yet something inside me refused to break. The love I felt was both shield and fuel, sustaining me through relentless challenges. Isolation remained, but it shifted in character. My focus was no longer entirely on my own survival. I had to think constantly about this new life. Simple errands became carefully planned missions, meals were meticulously prepared, health precautions became obsessive. I learned to function on little sleep, on pure instinct and determination, and gradually I discovered a rhythm. I began to trust myself more, to recognize that I could meet the demands of motherhood even without anyone's help. It was during one particularly difficult night that I met someone who would alter the trajectory of my life in subtle but profound ways. I was sitting on a bench outside the small park near my apartment, bundled against a bitter winter wind, cradling my child in my arms. I noticed a man jogging by, his pace slowing as he glanced at us. He didn't speak at first, just offered a small nod and a warm smile. There was something in his eyes, recognition, curiosity, perhaps even a gentle understanding, that caught me off guard. Over the following weeks, our encounters became more deliberate. He introduced himself as Daniel, a quiet, patient man who lived nearby. At first, I was cautious, wary of anyone approaching, protective of my fragile life. But Daniel moved slowly, never imposing, never demanding. He asked simple questions, listened attentively, and respected boundaries I hadn't realized I had established. There was a steadiness to him, a grounded presence that contrasted sharply with the chaos of my past and the unpredictability of my early months alone. As trust built, we began to share small conversations. At first, about mundane things, whether local events, minor grievances of daily life. But gradually our talks deepened. I found myself revealing fragments of my history, of my mistakes, my losses, my fears. Daniel never judged. He never offered unsolicited advice. Instead, he listened, sometimes quietly, sometimes reflecting back a perspective I hadn't considered. It was a revelation. Someone could witness pain without recoiling, could see vulnerability without exploitation. Through these interactions, I discovered a new dimension of human connection. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel seen, to be acknowledged not as a failure, but as a person navigating extraordinary circumstances. The presence of someone steady and compassionate was not a replacement for family or love lost, but a lifeline that offered both comfort and perspective. Even as I navigated this budding friendship, the realities of single motherhood pressed relentlessly. Financial strain persisted, sleep deprivation continued, and the emotional burden of raising a child alone was ever present. Yet I noticed subtle changes within myself. I was stronger than I had believed, more resourceful, more capable of balancing fear and responsibility. Daniel's presence did not lessen my autonomy. Instead, it provided a quiet reassurance that I could exist in the world with someone else without losing myself. Life's rhythm began to shift, slowly but perceptibly. Days of survival started to include moments of joy. Watching my child's first laugh, reading a book together in the afternoon sun, sharing a quiet meal. These were fleeting moments, yet they became precious markers of progress, evidence that despite everything, life could be both challenging and beautiful. Yet the shadows of my past lingered. Memories of betrayal, of abandonment, of family disapproval, and of a marriage that had ended in loss haunted my thoughts. There were nights when guilt and fear intertwined, whispering that I had failed, that my child deserved more, that the world was indifferent to my struggles. But I learned to confront these shadows directly. Writing, reflection, and candid conversation with Daniel allowed me to process the pain without being consumed by it. Through this period, I began to understand the true meaning of resilience. It was not simply surviving adversity, it was adapting, learning, and transforming in response to it. Every sleepless night, every financial worry, every pang of loneliness became part of the education of survival. I learned to move forward not in spite of my circumstances, but because of them. One day, as spring turned toward summer, Daniel invited me to a small local CAF, not as a date, but simply to share a cup of coffee. The gesture was unassuming, yet it represented a turning point. I realized that allowing connection did not weaken me, it strengthened me. I was capable of maintaining autonomy, while letting someone else enter my life, carefully and deliberately. It was a lesson in trust, in patience, in balance. Motherhood, of course, continued to demand everything. There were illnesses, sleepless nights, moments of despair, and days when I questioned my capacity to continue. But I also discovered profound joy in small victories. The first time my child crawled, the first time they smiled knowingly, the way they curled into my arms as if the world was safe because I was there. These moments became the foundation of a life rebuilt from loss, a testament to endurance and love. Through Daniel's steady presence, I began to see that human connection could coexist with independence. I did not need to surrender my autonomy to accept help, to share a moment of vulnerability, or to experience warmth and understanding. This realization was transformative. I began to imagine a future where my child would grow surrounded by love, support, and stability, even if that life looked different than the one I had once envisioned. The months passed, each one layering experience upon experience, struggle upon struggle, growth upon growth. I had learned to navigate the complexities of single parenthood, the practical challenges of finances and health, and the emotional terrain of fear, loneliness, and love. And as I reflected on the journey so far, I began to feel a quiet but insistent hope that the worst had not defined me, that the choices I had made, though painful, were shaping a life of meaning, strength, and resilience. After months of navigating life alone with my child, Daniel and I began spending more intentional time together. At first, it was tentative, a walk in the park, a coffee at a quiet CAF, a shared laugh over some trivial observation. I was careful. My heart, hardened by betrayal and abandonment, moved cautiously. Trust had to be earned slowly, layer by layer, not granted freely as it once had been. The presence of another adult in my daily life was both comforting and disorienting. I had grown used to the rhythms of solitude, to relying solely on myself for emotional, financial, and practical support. Suddenly, there was someone who asked questions about my day, who noticed small achievements, who celebrated moments of joy alongside me. It was foreign yet deeply welcome. Despite the growing connection, I was wary. The past had taught me that intimacy carried risk. The memory of my husband's departure, the silence from my family, and the hardships I had endured alone made me hesitant to allow someone new into my life too quickly. I questioned every gesture, every word, every expression of care. Was this real, or was it another temporary illusion? Daniel seemed to understand. He never pressed, never forced, never demanded. He was patient, quiet, and reliable. Over time, I allowed myself to share fragments of my life I had kept hidden, even from myself at times. The hardships, the nights spent crying alone, the fears of inadequacy as a mother. He listened without judgment. That ability to witness vulnerability without recoiling became a bridge between my solitude and a tentative trust. We began to imagine possibilities together, small and careful at first. Weekend trips to nearby towns, quiet dinners, reading together in the evening. The presence of stability was intoxicating, yet I constantly reminded myself to maintain boundaries. I was a mother first, and my child's well-being remained my primary concern. I could not allow new relationships to threaten the fragile life I had built from the ruins of the past. As our connection deepened, I began to notice changes within myself. My fears, though still present, became less paralyzing. I could imagine a life with someone who respected my autonomy and cared for my child, a life not defined by the absence of my family or the betrayal of my husband, but by choices I actively made. Each step forward required courage, and each moment of connection with Daniel reinforced my sense of agency. Yet, trust did not come easily. I caught myself scrutinizing every interaction, anticipating disappointment, preparing for eventual rejection. I asked myself whether allowing love into my life was foolish, whether it might leave me vulnerable once again. Daniel's patience was crucial. He never reacted with frustration, never demanded explanations beyond what I could offer, and never forced closeness before I was ready. This slow rebuilding of trust extended beyond romantic connection. I noticed my interactions with others shifting as well. Friends became more integral, yet I maintained the boundaries I had cultivated during my months of isolation. I began to recognize that connection did not necessitate dependence, and that asking for help or sharing joy could coexist with independence. These realizations reshaped my understanding of human relationships and my capacity for intimacy. Motherhood, meanwhile, remained an ever-present teacher. My child's needs were immediate and unyielding, demanding focus, patience, and energy. I developed routines, rituals, and strategies to navigate the constant demands while maintaining my emotional and physical well-being. Daniel became a supportive presence, participating in small ways that respected both my authority as a parent and my desire to protect our private world. There were setbacks, of course. Moments of doubt, exhaustion, and fear. Nights when the weight of responsibility pressed so heavily that I felt I might collapse. Financial challenges that required careful planning and ingenuity. Conflicts within my own mind, between desire for connection and fear of vulnerability. Yet each challenge was met with a growing resilience, a recognition that I had survived worse, and that the love I felt for my child and the tentative trust in Daniel could coexist with independence. As months turned into a year, our bond strengthened. It was not a whirlwind romance, but a steady, deliberate building of trust and companionship. I learned to navigate intimacy while safeguarding my emotional and practical needs. I discovered that love could exist without suffocating, without compromising the hard-won autonomy I had cultivated through months of struggle. At the same time, my family remained distant. Their disapproval, once piercing, had become a quiet backdrop, a reminder of the choices I had made and the life I had forged without their support. I realized that reconciliation, if it ever occurred, would have to be on my terms. I would not sacrifice the stability I had built for the sake of approval or guilt. This clarity strengthened me, reinforcing that my path was mine alone to define. Through it all, Daniel remained a consistent presence. His steadiness, his patience, and his quiet respect allowed me to experience connection without fear of loss. I began to imagine a future where love, trust, and family could coexist, not as an idealized fantasy but as a lived reality. My child, too, became a central participant in this emerging life, experiencing care, stability, and warmth from both of us. Slowly, the scars of the past began to fade. Not entirely, for some wounds are permanent, but enough to allow room for joy. I laughed more freely, allowed myself moments of relaxation, and even dreamed of a life beyond mere survival. The pain of betrayal, abandonment, and loss remained, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. I had learned to integrate it, to honor it, and to use it as a compass rather than a chain. By the end of the year, I had reached a place I never thought possible after such profound loss. I had a child I loved fiercely, a partner I trusted cautiously, and a life shaped by my choices rather than by the absence or rejection of others. It was not perfect, life rarely is, but it was ours, built deliberately, carefully, and resiliently. I realized that growth often comes through hardship, and that love, when approached with patience and respect, can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. My journey had taught me the value of boundaries, the necessity of self-respect, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And in this steady, deliberate life, I began to feel a sense of peace I had once thought impossible. By the time my child turned 2, I had built a life that felt both stable and nurturing. Daniel was no longer just a friend or support, he had become a partner in the truest sense. Someone who respected my boundaries, my independence, and my role as a mother. Together we had created routines, rituals, and spaces that allowed love and growth to flourish. I could not have imagined, even in my wildest hopes, that such peace was possible after the years of chaos, betrayal, and isolation I had endured. It was around this time that my family reached out. Their calls came cautiously, filled with tentative warmth, tinged with guilt. I listened politely, hearing the words they had once withheld. Apologies, expressions of concern, questions about my well-being. But I realized quickly that their return did not erase the years of absence, the harsh words, or the indifference they had shown when I needed them most. My heart recognized their desire to reconnect, but my mind reminded me of the life I had fought to build in their absence. I spoke with them honestly, sharing the story of my struggles, of the months spent alone, of the challenges of pregnancy and motherhood without support. I watched as shock, regret, and a mixture of relief crossed their faces. They expressed a desire to be part of my life again, to reconnect with me and with my child. For a moment I felt the familiar pull, the longing for the family I had loved and lost, the wish for acceptance and unconditional support. Yet I also understood that too much had changed. My priorities had shifted, my sense of self had hardened, and my responsibilities were clear. I could welcome them, but on terms that honored the life I had created and the stability I had fought for. Their presence could not come at the cost of peace, nor could it undo the growth I had achieved alone. With careful intention, I allowed them gradual re-entry into our lives. Visits were brief at first, measured in hours rather than days. Conversations were candid but respectful, centered on building understanding, rather than repeating past mistakes. I observed cautiously as my child formed connections with grandparents, aunts, and uncles, feeling both joy and apprehension. I wanted my child to experience love, but I also needed to ensure that the patterns of neglect and judgment would not repeat themselves. Daniel's presence continued to anchor me through this delicate process. He reminded me gently of my strength, of the autonomy I had cultivated, and of the life we were shaping together. His support allowed me to navigate the emotional complexity of reconciliation without losing myself or my child in the process. I realized that love, trust, and family could coexist, not perfectly, but in a way that respected boundaries and honored personal growth. Through these interactions, I also began to notice how much I had changed. The fear, anxiety, and uncertainty that had once dominated my life were now tempered by resilience, experience, and self-assurance. I could engage with my family without succumbing to old patterns of guilt or dependence. I could embrace connection while maintaining agency. I could honor my past without allowing it to define my present. The years continued, each bringing new milestones, small victories, and inevitable challenges. My child grew curious, strong, and joyful, a living testament to the endurance and care that had carried us through hardship. Daniel and I navigated parenthood together, balancing love, discipline, and guidance with respect for each other's strengths and limits. The life we had built was imperfect, but it was deliberate, conscious, and full of love. Eventually, my family's presence became more comfortable, more integrated into our daily lives. There were still moments of tension, reminders of past disappointments, and occasional disagreements. But the lessons I had learned, the importance of boundaries, the necessity of self-respect, the value of deliberate connection, allowed me to manage these moments without fear or despair. I had grown into someone capable of holding love and autonomy in the same hand. I also realized that forgiveness was a choice, not a requirement. I could forgive without forgetting, welcome without surrendering my peace, and allow love without compromising the life I had fought so hard to build. This understanding became central to my identity, shaping how I approached every relationship and every challenge thereafter. Looking back, I saw the trajectory of my life as a series of crucibles, moments of loss, betrayal, and abandonment that had forced me to confront my deepest fears and emerge stronger. The end of my marriage, the estrangement from my family, the months of solitary struggle, they had all been painful, yet they had also been formative. They had taught me resilience, self-reliance, and the capacity for deep, intentional love. In the quiet moments when I watched my child sleep or shared a peaceful evening with Daniel, I understood the profound depth of what I had achieved. I had taken the fragments of a life shattered by absence and betrayal and rebuilt it with deliberate care, courage, and love. I had learned to navigate loss without being defined by it, to cultivate trust without losing autonomy, and to embrace family on terms that honored the life I had created. Ultimately, I recognized that life does not always allow for perfect timing or ideal resolutions. My family returned, but only after I had forged the stability and love that made their presence welcome rather than necessary. I had learned to trust myself, to value my own judgment, and to prioritize the well-being of my child above all else. And in doing so, I had discovered the true meaning of strength, resilience, and love. A life not defined by loss, but by the courage to create anew. And so, as I sit quietly in our home, watching the laughter of my child and sharing glances of quiet understanding with Daniel, I realize that life has granted me something precious. The power to rebuild, the freedom to love on my own terms, and the profound knowledge that even in the face of betrayal, abandonment, and fear, it is possible to create a life filled with connection, hope, and unwavering resilience.